The moment a single father's simple gesture shattered 18 months of heartbreaking silence, CEO Julia Morgan realized that sometimes the most powerful breakthroughs come from the most unexpected places. Her mute daughter Sophie hadn't spoken since the tragic accident that claimed her father's life, and every expensive therapy session had failed. But on this ordinary Tuesday at Willowbrook Park, a stranger with a magic stone was about to change everything. Stay with me until the end of this incredible story, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this tale of hope and healing has traveled. The autumn wind whispered through the golden leaves of Willowbrook Park as Julia Morgan sat rigidly on the weathered wooden bench, her manicured fingers gripping a lukewarm coffee cup that had long since lost its appeal. Her steel-gray eyes, the same ones that commanded boardrooms and negotiated million-dollar deals, now held nothing but exhaustion, and a grief so profound it seemed to emanate from her very soul. 30 feet away, her 7-year-old daughter Sophie sat motionless on the swing set, her small frame barely moving, despite the gentle push Julia had given her moments earlier. The child's dark hair fell like a curtain around her face, hiding eyes that had once sparkled with laughter, but now reflected only the hollow emptiness that had consumed their lives for the past 18 months. "Sophie, sweetheart, do you want to go higher?" Julia called out, her voice carrying that forced cheerfulness. She'd perfected the same tone she used in client meetings when deals were falling apart, but she needed to project confidence. Nothing. Not even a glance. Julia's heart clenched with the familiar ache that had become her constant companion. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, Sophie's latest therapist, had warned her that patience would be crucial. Selective mutism following trauma, the woman had explained in her clinical, detached voice during their last session. Sophie's mind has created a protective barrier. Pushing too hard could reinforce the silence. But 18 months of silence felt like an eternity. 18 months of watching her vibrant, chattering daughter become a ghost of herself. 18 months of failed therapy sessions, expensive specialists, and well-meaning relatives offering advice that felt like salt in an open wound. The irony wasn't lost on Julia. She was Julia Morgan, CEO of Morgan Strategic Consulting, a woman who built her empire on the power of words, on communication, on making the impossible happen, through sheer force of will and carefully crafted arguments. Yet she couldn't coax a single word from the most important person in her world. A squeal of laughter pierced the afternoon air, causing Julia to look up sharply. A little girl with bouncing red curls was racing toward the playground equipment, her infectious giggles trailing behind her like musical notes. Behind her jogged a man in his mid-30s, his sandy hair slightly mussed, and a genuine smile lighting up his face. "Grace, remember what we talked about, be mindful of other children," the man called out, his voice warm with affection rather than scolding. "I will, Daddy, I just want to swing super high today," Grace replied, her enthusiasm bubbling over as she claimed the swing next to Sophie. Julia tensed instinctively. Other children had tried to engage with Sophie before, and it never ended well. The confusion in their young faces when Sophie didn't respond, the inevitable questions from parents, the awkward explanations that made Julia feel like she was failing her daughter all over again. But something different happened this time. Grace began to swing her legs, pumping with determination, and started humming a melody that seemed to dance through the air. She didn't try to talk to Sophie directly. Instead, she simply existed in her joyful bubble, occasionally letting out delighted wheeze as she gained height. And for the first time in months, Julia saw something remarkable. Sophie's head turned slightly toward the sound. The man, Grace's father, approached the swings with easy confidence. He was tall, but not imposing, with laugh lines around his eyes that suggested someone comfortable with joy. His clothes were casual but clean, dark jeans, a navy sweater, and sneakers that had clearly seen plenty of playground duty. "Mind if I give you a push?" he asked Sophie gently, his tone no different than if he were addressing any other child. Julia started to stand ready to intervene with her practiced explanation about Sophie's condition, but something in the man's demeanor made her pause. He wasn't waiting for an answer. He simply positioned himself behind Sophie's swing and gave her a gentle push, then another. "That's my daddy," Grace announced proudly to Sophie, though she continued swinging. "He gives the best pushes in the whole world. Sometimes he even makes whooshing sounds like we're flying through clouds." The man chuckled. "Guilty as charged. I'm Daniel, by the way," he said, addressing both Sophie and Julia. "And this bundle of energy is Grace." "I'm not a bundle," Grace protested with mock indignation. "I'm a person." "You're absolutely right," Daniel replied solemnly. "You're Grace, the person who happens to be full of wonderful energy." Julia found herself almost smiling, despite the knot of anxiety in her chest. When was the last time she'd heard such easy banter, such uncomplicated joy? "And what's your name?" Daniel asked Sophie as he continued the gentle rhythm of pushing her swing. Silence stretched between them, but Daniel seemed completely unbothered. He didn't repeat the question or push for an answer. Instead, he simply continued the swinging motion and began humming along with Grace's melody. "Sophie's a beautiful name for flying," Grace declared suddenly. "It sounds like wind in trees. Whoosh, Sophie." Julia held her breath. Sophie's shoulders tensed slightly, but she didn't pull away or ask to get down. If anything, she seemed to lean into the motion of the swing. "Grace has this theory," Daniel explained conversationally to Sophie, "that every name has its own flying sound. Mine apparently sounds like thunder, which Grace demonstrates by stomping around the house." "It does sound like thunder," Grace insisted. "Dan-eel." She emphasized each syllable with dramatic flair. "See thunder." For just a moment so brief, Julia almost missed it. Sophie's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close, something real. Daniel noticed too, though he didn't make a big deal of it. "What do you think Sophie's flying sound would be?" he asked Grace. Grace considered this with the seriousness only children could bring to such matters. "Soft like whispers," she decided. "Like when you're telling secrets to clouds." Julia felt tears prick at her eyes. When had anyone spoken to Sophie with such natural imagination? Most adults either tried too hard to be entertaining or became uncomfortable with her silence. But Daniel and Grace seemed to exist in a world where silence was just another form of communication. "Daddy, can we play cloud flying?" Grace asked, already slowing her swing. "What's cloud flying?" Daniel asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "It's when you pretend the swings are magic, and you're flying through clouds, and you have to make the sounds of wind and birds, and maybe dragons if there are any nearby dragons," Grace explained matter-of-factly. "Ah, of course. How could I forget?" Daniel grinned and looked at Sophie. "Would you like to try cloud flying? It's pretty advanced stuff, but I think you might be ready for it." Sophie's grip on the swing chains tightened, but she didn't shake her head or try to get down. Julia recognized the signs her daughter was listening, really listening for the first time in months. Daniel moved to Grace's swing and gave her a bigger push. "Okay, Captain Grace, you're cleared for takeoff. Report on cloud conditions." "The clouds are fluffy today," Grace announced, throwing her head back as she swung higher. "And I see a cloud shaped like an elephant." "Copy that, Captain Grace. Sophie, you're co-pilot on this mission. Your job is to spot any interesting cloud formations." Julia watched in amazement as Sophie actually looked up at the sky, her dark eyes scanning the scattered white clouds drifting overhead. It was such a simple thing, But Julia couldn't remember the last time she'd seen her daughter actively engage with the world around her. "Oh," Grace gasped suddenly. "Sophie, do you see that cloud that looks like a butterfly right there?" She pointed enthusiastically while still swinging. Sophie followed Grace's gesture, and Julia saw her daughter's eyes widen slightly. She was seeing it too. "Excellent spotting, both pilots," Daniel said officially. "Now the most important part of cloud flying is the landing. You have to slow down gradually, like you're settling onto a soft cloud." As the swings began to slow, Daniel started making gentle whooshing sounds, not loudly or dramatically, but with a quiet enthusiasm that felt completely natural. Grace joined in, immediately adding her own sound effects. And then so quietly that Julia almost missed it, she heard something that made her heart stop. A soft whoosh from Sophie. It was barely audible, more breath than voice, but it was there. Sophie had made a sound. Her first intentional sound in 18 months. Julia's hands flew to her mouth, coffee cup forgotten, as it tumbled to the ground. Daniel caught her eye over Sophie's head and gave her the slightest nod. He'd heard it too, but his expression conveyed clearly that they shouldn't make a big deal of it. "Perfect landing, pilots," he said calmly as the swings came to a stop. "That was some excellent flying." Grace hopped off her swing with characteristic enthusiasm. "Sophie, did you like cloud flying? It's even better when there are dragons, but they're usually only out on Sundays." Sophie climbed down from her swing more slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. For a moment, she stood very still, looking at Grace with an expression Julia couldn't quite read. "Then McCall of miracles." Sophie nodded. It was tiny, barely perceptible, but it was communication. Real, intentional communication. "Tomorrow's Wednesday." Grace continued, seemingly oblivious to the magnitude of what had just occurred. "But sometimes, if you ask very nicely, dragons will come out on other days too. You have to use your best flying voice, though." Julia saw Daniel's slight wince at Grace's innocent comment about using her voice, but Sophie didn't seem troubled by it. Instead, she was looking at Grace with something that might have been curiosity. "Grace, why don't you show Sophie the climbing structure?" Daniel suggested. "I think there might be a good dragon spotting tower over there." As the girls walked toward the playground equipment, Grace chattering and Sophie listening, Daniel approached Julia's bench. "I hope we weren't intruding," he said quietly. "Grace gets excited about making new friends." Julia shook her head, not trusting her voice for a moment. When she finally spoke, her words came out husky with emotion. Sophie hasn't made a sound in 18 months. Not since." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Daniel's expression softened with understanding. "Trauma." Julia nodded, surprised by how easily this stranger seemed to grasp the situation. "Car accident. Her father." She took a shaky breath. "The doctors say she's physically fine, but mentally, sometimes the mind protects us in ways that don't feel protective," Daniel said gently. "How old was she when it happened?" 5.5. She was such a chatterbox before. Never stopped talking, asking questions, singing songs she made up. Julia's voice broke slightly. "I'd give anything to hear her voice again." They watched as Grace pointed out various features of the playground, to Sophie her animated gestures and ongoing commentary, providing a sharp contrast to Sophie's quiet attention. "Grace lost her mother 2 years ago," Daniel said quietly. "Cancer. She went through a period where she talked constantly, as if words could fill the silence her mom left behind. Everyone grieves differently." Julia turned to look at him fully for the first time. There was something in his eyes, not pity, but recognition. the look of someone who understood loss intimately. "I'm sorry," she said. "Thank you. We're managing." Grace helps me remember that there's still joy to be found, even in the middle of heartbreak. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their daughters. Grace was now demonstrating how to cross the monkey bars, her technique more enthusiasm than skill. Sophie stood below, looking up with what might have been the beginning of interest. "What do you do?" Julia asked, partly to distract herself from the hope building in her chest, and partly because she was genuinely curious about this man who had somehow reached her daughter in minutes when professionals had failed for months. "I'm a music therapist," Daniel replied. "I work with children, mainly helping them process emotions and trauma through sound and rhythm." Julia's eyebrows rose. "Music therapy. I know it sounds alternative, but there's solid science behind it. Music accesses parts of the brain that regular speech doesn't. Sometimes when words feel too dangerous, melody can be a safer way to communicate." As if summoned by their conversation, Grace's voice rang out across the playground. "Sophie, listen to this." She began humming a simple tune while hanging from the monkey bars. To Julia's amazement, Sophie stepped closer, her head tilted as she listened intently. "Grace has perfect pitch," Daniel said with obvious pride. "She's been musical since she could babble. It's one of the ways she processes the world." "Sophie used to sing all the time," Julia murmured, the memory hitting her like a physical blow. She'd make up these elaborate songs about everything: what she had for breakfast, what the cat was doing, stories about imaginary friends. "The house is so quiet now." Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching Sophie watch Grace. "Would you be open to bringing Sophie by my practice sometime? No pressure, no expectations. Sometimes it helps just to be in an environment where sound is safe." Julia felt a flutter of something she'd almost forgotten: hope. But with it came the familiar fear of disappointment. They'd tried so many things, invested so much emotion in treatments that promised breakthroughs and delivered only more silence. "I don't know," she said honestly. "We've been to so many specialists, tried so many approaches. I'm not sure I can handle another failure." "I understand," Daniel said simply. "The offer stands whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready. Sometimes the best thing we can do is just be present. No agenda, no timeline." A shriek of delight drew their attention back to the playground. Grace had somehow managed to convince Sophie to try the slide, not the big twisty one, but a smaller, gentler slope. Sophie was climbing the steps slowly, Grace cheering her on from below. "That's it, you're so brave, Sophie. Sliding is almost as good as flying." Julia held her breath as Sophie reached the top of the slide. For a moment, her daughter hesitated, looking down at the smooth surface that probably seemed much higher from up there. "You don't have to if you don't want to," Grace called up. "But if you do want to, I'll catch you at the bottom. Well, not really catch you, because that might hurt, but I'll be here to celebrate. And then, miracle of miracles." Sophie pushed off. She came down the slide faster than she'd expected, her eyes wide with surprise. And at the bottom, just as she came to a stop, she made another sound. Not quite a laugh, but a soft exhalation that held the ghost of joy. Grace clapped her hands together. "That was amazing." "Did you feel like you were flying?" "I always feel like I'm flying on slides." Sophie looked up at Grace, and for just a moment, Julia saw her daughter's face transform. Not into the bright, animated expression she'd worn before the accident, but into something softer, newer. Something that acknowledged that perhaps maybe there could still be moments of lightness in the world. "Daddy, can we show Sophie the secret fort?" Grace asked, bounding over to where the adults sat. "What secret fort?" Daniel asked with exaggerated confusion. The one behind the big oak tree. It's not really secret anymore because I just told everyone, but it's still pretty cool." Julia looked at her watch and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling back on her shoulders. "We should probably head home soon, sweetheart," she called to Sophie. Sophie's face fell slightly. Such a small change that most people would have missed it, but Julia had become an expert at reading her daughter's micro-expressions. "5 more minutes," Grace pleaded on Sophie's behalf. "The fort is really close and Sophie hasn't seen the best part of the playground yet." Julia found herself looking to Daniel as if seeking permission from this near stranger who had somehow become an ally in the span of an hour. "5 minutes sounds perfect," Daniel said easily. "Just enough time for a quick fort inspection." As the girls headed toward the large oak tree at the far end of the playground, Julia and Daniel followed at a distance. "Thank you," Julia said quietly. "I don't know what you did, but she's been different today. More present." "I didn't do anything special," Daniel replied. "Grace did most of the work. Sometimes kids speak the same language in ways adults forget how to." They watched as Grace led Sophie to a small clearing behind the oak tree where someone had arranged fallen logs into a rough circle. It wasn't much of a fort by adult standards, but through children's eyes, Julia could see how it might feel magical. "This is where I come to think important thoughts," Grace announced solemnly, "and sometimes where I talk to Mommy." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Julia felt her throat tighten with emotion, not just for her own loss, but for this bright little girl who had found her own ways to cope with grief. Sophie walked around the circle of logs, her fingers trailing along the rough bark. When she completed the circle, she sat down on one of the logs and looked up at Grace expectantly. "Oh, you want to hear about the important thoughts?" Grace interpreted. She plopped down on the log across from Sophie. "Well, mostly I think about whether dogs can see colors and if clouds are actually sheep that got lost, and whether Mommy can see me from heaven when I'm being really good." Sophie listened with the intensity she'd once reserved for her favorite bedtime stories. Julia remembered how Sophie used to hang on every word when Julia read to her, asking endless questions about characters and plot points and begging for just one more chapter. "What kind of important thoughts do you think?" Grace asked Sophie directly. The question hung in the air, and Julia tensed automatically. This was usually when other children got frustrated with Sophie's silence, when the magic of the moment would break and reality would come crashing back. But Grace seemed content to wait, swinging her legs and humming softly, while Sophie considered the question. And then so quietly that Julia almost missed it again, Sophie whispered, "Daddy thoughts." Julia's knees nearly buckled. Daniel's hand shot out to steady her, his grip warm and reassuring. Grace didn't react with surprise or excitement. Instead, she nodded solemnly, as if Sophie had just shared the most natural thing in the world. "Those are the most important thoughts of all," Grace said simply. "I have lots of mommy thoughts, too. Sometimes they make me sad, but sometimes they make me happy because I remember good things." Sophie nodded, a real definitive nod this time. "Do you want to tell the fort about your daddy thoughts?" Grace asked. "The fort is really good at keeping secrets and making sad thoughts feel less heavy." For a long moment, Sophie was silent. Julia held her breath, afraid to hope, afraid to even move lest she break whatever spell was being woven in this makeshift circle of logs. Then Sophie spoke again, her voice still barely above a whisper, but unmistakably there. "He liked swings, too." The words hit Julia like a physical blow. Michael had indeed loved swings. He used to spend hours pushing Sophie at their neighborhood park, making up elaborate stories about where she was flying, to what adventures awaited her in the clouds. "I bet he was really good at pushing," Grace said thoughtfully. The best daddies always give the best pushes. He made whoosh sounds too. Sophie continued, her voice gaining just a fraction more strength. Different whoosh sounds for different kinds of flying. Julia was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she listened to her daughter speak about her father for the first time since the accident. Daniel's hand was still on her shoulder, anchoring her to the moment. My mommy used to sing me flying songs, Grace shared. Sometimes I still hear them in the wind. Maybe your daddy's whoosh sounds are still in the wind too. Sophie looked up at the sky where the late afternoon light was beginning to paint the clouds in shades of gold and pink. Maybe, she whispered, and then, as if the conversation had unlocked something deep inside her, Sophie began to talk. Not in the endless stream of consciousness that had characterized her speech before the accident, but in careful, measured sentences that felt precious and deliberate. She told Grace about how her daddy used to take her to feed ducks at the pond, how he would let her stand on his feet while they danced in the kitchen, how he made funny voices when he read her bedtime stories. Grace listened to every word with the kind of attention most adults couldn't sustain, occasionally asking gentle questions or sharing related memories of her own mother. Julia and Daniel stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, afraid that any movement might break the spell. This was more than Sophie had said in 18 months, not just in quantity, but in emotional depth. She was processing, grieving, remembering out loud for the first time. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, painting everything in warm golden light, the girls' conversation naturally wound down. Sophie had talked herself into a kind of peaceful exhaustion, while Grace seemed satisfied that she'd made a real friend. We should probably head home, Julia said softly, her voice still thick with emotion. Sophie stood up from her log slowly, as if reluctant to leave this magical circle where words had become possible again. Will you come back to the playground? Grace asked hopefully. Maybe tomorrow we could practice more cloud flying, and I could show you the dragon spotting techniques. Sophie looked to Julia, and in that look Julia saw a question, permission maybe, or hope that this hadn't been just a one-time occurrence. We can come back, Julia promised, her voice steadier now. If you'd like to. Sophie nodded, then did something that made Julia's heart soar. She walked over to Grace and very carefully, very deliberately, gave her a small hug. Thank you for sharing your fort, Sophie whispered into Grace's ear. Thank you for sharing your daddy thoughts, Grace whispered back. As they walked back through the park toward the parking area, Sophie stayed close to Julia's side but kept looking back toward where Grace and Daniel were gathering their own things. The afternoon had shifted something fundamental, not just in Sophie's willingness to speak, but in the way she moved through the world. Julia, Daniel called out as they reached the edge of the parking lot. She turned Sophie's hand warm in hers. My practice is on Maple Street, just past the library. The door's always open if you change your mind about that visit. Julia nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Too much had happened, too much hope had been kindled, and she needed time to process it all. As they drove home in Julia's sleek black sedan, Sophie was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the hollow silence of the past 18 months, but a thoughtful, processing quiet. In the rearview mirror, Julia could see her daughter looking out the window, her lips moving slightly, as if she were practicing words, or maybe just remembering the feel of them. When they pulled into their driveway, a sprawling colonial in an upscale neighborhood where the lawns were always perfectly manicured and the silence was usually oppressive, Sophie spoke again. Mama. Julia's hands tightened on the steering wheel. It was the first time Sophie had called her anything other than a gesture or a look in over a year. Yes, sweetheart. Can we go back tomorrow to see Grace and the flying swings? Julia turned in her seat to look at her daughter fully. Sophie's dark eyes, so much like Michael's, held a spark that Julia had thought might be gone forever. Yes, Julia whispered. We can go back tomorrow. As they walked up the front steps to their house, Julia felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the possibility that tomorrow might be different than today. That maybe, just maybe, the long silence was finally beginning to break. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made everything feel possible. Julia woke to find Sophie already dressed and sitting by her bedroom window, looking out toward the direction of Willowbrook Park. It was the first time in 18 months that her daughter had shown initiative about going anywhere. "Good morning, sweetheart," Julia said softly, settling beside Sophie on the window seat. "Sleep well." Sophie nodded, then surprised Julia by speaking without prompting. "I dreamed about flying. With Daddy." The words were simple, but they carried weight. For so long, Sophie's dreams had been filled with the screech of brakes and twisted metal nightmares that left her sobbing silently in Julia's arms. A dream about flying felt like a small miracle. "That sounds like a beautiful dream," Julia replied, smoothing Sophie's dark hair. "Are you ready for breakfast? We can head to the park after." "Can we bring the magic stone?" Sophie asked, her voice still whisper-soft, but gaining confidence. Julia paused, confused. "What magic stone, honey?" "The one Daniel told Grace about. For making voices stronger." Sophie's eyes were serious, as if this stone was the most important thing in the world. Julia's heart clenched with understanding. In the magical thinking of childhood, Sophie had latched onto the idea that there might be something tangible that could help her voice return. The fact that no such stone had actually been mentioned didn't matter. Sophie's mind had created what she needed to believe in. "We can look for one," Julia promised. "I bet there are lots of magic stones at the park." An hour later, they were walking through Willowbrook Park again, Sophie's hand tucked securely in Julia's. The morning light filtered through the trees differently than the afternoon sun had the day before, creating new patterns of shadow and brightness that made everything feel fresh and full of possibility. Grace and Daniel were already there, sitting on a picnic blanket near the playground. Grace spotted them first and jumped up with characteristic enthusiasm. "Sophie, you came back. I knew you would." Grace's joy was infectious, and Julia saw Sophie's steps quicken slightly as they approached. "Good morning," Daniel said, rising to greet them. His smile was warm but not overwhelming, striking that perfect balance of friendliness without pressure that had worked so well the day before. "We brought hot chocolate in case anyone was interested." "Sophie loves hot chocolate," Julia found herself saying, then realized she wasn't even sure if that was still true. So many of Sophie's preferences had seemed to disappear along with her voice. But Sophie nodded, settling onto the edge of the blanket with careful deliberation. Grace immediately scooted closer, chattering about the morning's discoveries. "I already checked the dragon situation," Grace reported seriously. "There's definitely one hiding behind that big cloud over there, but it seems friendly. And look." She pointed to a small pile of smooth stones she'd collected. "I found some potential magic stones for cloud flying." Sophie's eyes lit up at the sight of the stones. She reached out tentatively, then looked at Daniel for permission. "Those are all yours to examine," Daniel said solemnly. "Finding the right magic stone is very important work. It has to feel just right in your hand." Sophie picked up each stone carefully, weighing them in her small palm. Julia watched fascinated as her daughter's expression grew thoughtful and focused. She'd always been a tactile child, needing to touch and explore things to understand them. This one, Sophie said, finally holding up a smooth gray stone about the size of a quarter. It feels warm. Excellent choice, Grace approved. That one definitely looks magical. See how it's perfectly round. That's usually a sign. Daniel poured hot chocolate from a thermos into paper cups, the steam rising in the cool morning air. Sophie accepted hers with a quiet, "Thank you." Another small victory that made Julia's chest tight with emotion. "So," Daniel said conversationally, "Grace has been working on a new flying technique this morning. Something about spiral flying. Maybe you could demonstrate, Captain Grace." Grace leaped up eagerly. "Oh yes, spiral flying is when you swing in a twisty pattern instead of just back and forth. It's much more advanced than regular cloud flying." As Grace ran toward the swings, Sophie stood up to follow, clutching her stone tightly. Julia started to rise as well, but Daniel's gentle touch on her arm stopped her. "She's okay," he said quietly. "Sometimes the best thing we can do is trust them to navigate their own healing." Julia settled back down, though every instinct screamed at her to hover protectively. She'd spent 18 months trying to shield Sophie from anything that might trigger more trauma, but watching her daughter engage with the world again was forcing her to reconsider that approach. Grace was already on a swing, demonstrating her spiral technique with more enthusiasm than actual skill. "See, Sophie, you have to twist the chains first, then let them unwind while you swing. It's like being in a tornado, but a good tornado." Sophie climbed onto the adjacent swing, still holding her stone. For a moment, she just sat there, watching Grace's wild spinning with what might have been amusement. "Want me to help you twist the chains?" Grace offered. "It's easier with a partner." Sophie nodded, and Grace hopped down to help arrange the swing chains in the twisted position. "Okay, now hold on tight and let it unwind." As Sophie began to spin, Julia held her breath. The motion was disorienting, and she feared it might trigger memories of the accident. The spinning, the loss of control, the terror. But instead, as Sophie spun and swung simultaneously, something magical happened. She laughed. It was just a small sound, barely more than a giggle, but it was pure joy. Julia felt tears spring to her eyes as she watched her daughter experience something approximating happiness for the first time in over a year. "That's it," Grace cheered. "You're doing it. How does it feel?" Like flying through a kaleidoscope," Sophie said, her voice stronger than Julia had heard it since the accident. The description was so perfectly Sophie, creative, visual, thoughtful. Before the accident, she'd been constantly coming up with unique ways to describe the world around her, metaphors that surprised and delighted the adults in her life. "A kaleidoscope," Grace repeated with delight. "That's exactly what it's like, Daddy." "Did you hear Sophie said it's like flying through a kaleidoscope?" Daniel smiled from the blanket. "I heard. That's beautiful, Sophie. I never would have thought to describe it that way." As the morning progressed, Julia watched her daughter slowly unfold like a flower in sunlight. The words came more frequently, though still quietly. Sophie shared that she liked the way the wind sounded in the oak tree leaves. She asked Grace about her red curls, wondering if they bounced when she ran. She even offered to help gather more magic stones for future flying missions. But it was when they were sitting in the secret fort again that the real breakthrough happened. Grace had been telling Sophie about her mother's garden, how it was full of flowers that bloomed at different times of the year. "Mommy said gardens teach you about waiting for beautiful things," Grace explained. "Some flowers come fast and some flowers take a really long time, but they're all worth waiting for." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, turning her magic stone over in her hands. When she finally spoke, her words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for too long. I miss my daddy's voice, she said. Sometimes I try to remember what it sounded like when he read me stories, but it gets fuzzy, like trying to remember a dream. Julia, who had been sitting on the edge of the fort circle, felt her heart break and heal simultaneously. This was what Dr. Hendricks had been hoping for Sophie, processing her grief out loud, working through the complicated emotions of loss. What kind of voice did he have? Grace asked gently. Deep and rumbly, like when you put your ear on someone's chest and you can feel the words inside them, Sophie said. He did different voices for all the characters in books. The mean characters always sounded scratchy, and the kind characters sounded like honey. He sounds like he was really good at reading stories, Grace said. He was the best. Sophie's voice wavered slightly. Sometimes I pretend he's still reading to me at night, but it's not the same when it's just pretend. Grace considered this seriously. Maybe he is still reading to you, just in a way you can't hear with your ears. Maybe you have to listen with your heart instead. It was such a mature sentiment from such a young child that Julia wondered if Grace was repeating something Daniel had told her about her own mother. Do you think so? Sophie asked hopefully. I know so, Grace said, with the confidence only children possessed. My mommy still talks to me too. Not with words, but with feelings, like when I'm sad, and suddenly I smell her perfume, or when I'm scared, and I remember how safe her hugs felt. Sophie nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense to her. Sometimes I smell his cologne in my room. Mama says it's not really there, but I smell it anyway. Julia's breath caught. Sophie had never mentioned this before, and Julia had indeed assumed it was imagination, when Sophie had occasionally claimed to smell Michael's cologne in impossible places. It is really there, Grace said firmly. Just because grown-ups can't smell it doesn't mean it's not real. Love has its own smell. The simple wisdom of this statement hung in the air between them. Julia found herself thinking about all the times she'd dismissed Sophie's claims of sensing her father's presence, how she'd tried to gently redirect her daughter toward reality, instead of honoring these moments of connection. Grace is right, Julia said softly, speaking for the first time since the girls had begun their conversation. Love does have its own smell, and if you smell Daddy's cologne, then it's real. Sophie turned to look at her mother with surprise and something that might have been relief. Really? Really, Julia confirmed. I'm sorry I didn't believe you before. It was a small acknowledgement, but it seemed to shift something fundamental between them. Sophie's shoulders relaxed as if she'd been carrying the weight of not being believed and could finally set it down. Mama, Sophie said suddenly. Can I ask you something? Anything, sweetheart. Do you think Daddy would be proud of me for talking again? The question hit Julia like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on her own grief, her own desperation to hear Sophie's voice again, that she hadn't considered how Sophie might be processing the idea of healing in relation to her father's memory. Oh, sweetheart, Julia said, moving closer to her daughter. Daddy would be so proud of you, not just for talking, but for being brave enough to make a new friend, for trying new things, for sharing your feelings. He would be proud of you no matter what. Even when I couldn't talk, Sophie asked, her voice very small. Especially when you couldn't talk, Julia said firmly. Because that meant you were protecting yourself when you needed to. That's very smart and very brave. Sophie seemed to consider this, rolling her magic stone between her palms. I think I was tired of being quiet inside my head, she said finally. It got too lonely in there. Talking makes the loneliness smaller, Grace agreed sagely. At least that's what my daddy tells me when I'm sad about Mommy. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Daniel appeared at the edge of the fort clearing. "Sorry to interrupt," he said gently, "but I thought you might be getting hungry. There's a food truck in the parking lot selling grilled cheese sandwiches." "Grilled cheese?" Grace exclaimed, jumping up. "Sophie, do you like grilled cheese? It's basically the perfect food because it's cheese and bread and butter all melted together into happiness." Sophie stood up slowly, still clutching her stone. "I used to like grilled cheese," she said thoughtfully. "Before. I don't know if I still do." It was such an honest, vulnerable admission that Julia felt her throat tighten. How many of Sophie's preferences had been lost along with her voice? How much of her daughter's personality was still buried under layers of protective silence? "There's only one way to find out," Daniel said practically. "And if you don't like it anymore, that's okay too. Sometimes when big things change in our lives, little things change too." As they walked toward the parking lot, Sophie stayed close to Julia's side, but kept glancing over at Grace, who was skipping ahead and providing running commentary on the merits of different grilled cheese techniques. "The secret," Grace was saying, "is to butter the outside of the bread, not just the inside. And you have to use real cheese, not the plastic kind that doesn't melt right. My daddy taught me that." "Your daddy knows about cooking?" Sophie asked. "He had to learn when Mommy got sick," Grace said matter-of-factly. "At first he burned everything, but now he's pretty good. He makes the best pancakes on Saturdays." Julia felt a pang of recognition. She'd had to learn so many things after Michael died. Things he'd always handled, like fixing leaky faucets and programming the thermostat and making Sophie's favorite bedtime snacks. The learning curve of sudden single parenthood was steep and unforgiving. The food truck was painted bright yellow, with cartoon sandwiches dancing across its sides. The smell of butter and melted cheese filled the air, and Julia was surprised to see Sophie's nose twitch with what might have been interest. "What can I get for you folks?" the vendor asked cheerfully. "4 grilled cheese sandwiches, please," Daniel said. "And maybe some of those apple slices if you have them." As they waited for their order, Sophie stood very still, watching the vendor work through the truck's service window. The sizzle of butter in the pan seemed to hold her attention completely. "That sounds like rain on the roof," Sophie observed quietly. "What does—" Julia asked. "The sandwich cooking. It sounds like gentle rain." It was another one of those perfectly Sophie observations, finding poetry in everyday sounds. Julia felt a surge of hope that maybe more pieces of her daughter's personality would resurface as she continued to heal. When their sandwiches were ready, they found a picnic table in the shade of a large maple tree. Grace immediately bit into her sandwich with enthusiasm, making appreciative humming sounds. Sophie approached her sandwich more cautiously, taking a small bite and chewing thoughtfully. Julia held her breath, waiting for the verdict. "It tastes like before," Sophie said finally. "But different too, like a memory that's real again." Julia wasn't entirely sure what that meant, but something in Sophie's tone suggested it was positive. Her daughter took another bite, slightly bigger this time. "Food tastes different when you're sad," Grace said with surprising wisdom. "Everything was too salty for a while after Mommy died. But then it got normal again mostly." "How long did it take," Sophie asked, "for food to taste normal again?" Grace considered this seriously, a string of cheese hanging from her sandwich. "I don't know exactly. A long time, but not forever. Daddy says healing isn't like a race where you can see the finish line. It's more like growing where you don't notice it's happening until one day you realize you're taller." Sophie nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "I think maybe I'm growing again. Just a little bit." Julia felt tears threaten again. The metaphor was so perfect, so hopeful. After 18 months of feeling like they were stuck in amber, frozen in the moment of their loss, the idea of growth felt revolutionary. "Growing is good," Daniel said quietly, "even when it happens slowly." As they ate their lunch, the conversation flowed more naturally than it had since the accident. Sophie asked Grace about her school, her favorite subjects, whether she had any pets. Grace answered enthusiastically, then turned the questions back to Sophie, who found herself sharing more than she had in months. She told Grace about her cat, Mr. Whiskers, who liked to sleep on her homework and made it hard to do math problems. She mentioned her favorite book, which was about a girl who could talk to trees. She even actually laughed out loud, when Grace told her about the time she'd tried to teach her goldfish to fetch. Julia watched this normal childhood interaction with wonder. When had she last seen Sophie be simply ordinarily happy? When had her daughter last been interested in someone else's stories, engaged with the world beyond her own grief? "Sophie," Grace said suddenly, "do you want to come to my house sometime? I could show you my room and maybe we could practice our flying voices together." Sophie looked to Julia with a question in her eyes. The idea of a play date, something that had once been such a normal part of their lives, felt both thrilling and terrifying. "That sounds lovely," Julia heard herself saying. "If it's okay with your daddy, of course." "More than okay," Daniel replied. "Grace has been asking for a friend to show her collections to. She's quite the rock and feather collector." "I have 17 special rocks and 23 perfect feathers," Grace said proudly. "And a shell that sounds like the ocean when you put it to your ear, even though we live nowhere near any ocean." "Can I bring my magic stone?" Sophie asked. "In case we need it for flying practice. Of course, magic stones are always welcome in my room." As they finished their lunch and prepared to leave the park, Julia felt something shift in the air between them. This was no longer just a chance encounter. They were becoming something like friends, these two little girls and their single parents navigating loss and healing in their own ways. "Same time tomorrow?" Grace asked hopefully as they gathered their things. Sophie looked at Julia, then back at Grace. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "Same time tomorrow." Walking back to their cars, Julia found herself walking beside Daniel, while the girls skipped ahead, Grace showing Sophie the best spots for finding interesting leaves. "Thank you," Julia said quietly. "I don't know how to express what this means to us." "Grace needed this too," Daniel replied. "She's been so focused on taking care of me that I think she forgot how to just be a kid sometimes. Having a friend who understands loss, it's good for both of them." Julia glanced ahead at their daughters, who were now examining an acorn with the seriousness of scientists studying a rare specimen. "It's strange," she said. "I've spent so much energy trying to protect Sophie from anything that might remind her of what we lost. But being around Grace talking about grief openly, it seems to be helping rather than hurting. Sometimes facing the thing we're afraid of takes away its power over us," Daniel said. "Not all at once, but gradually, like slowly turning up the lights in a dark room." As they reached their cars, Sophie surprised everyone by walking up to Daniel and looking up at him seriously. "Thank you for teaching me about cloud flying," she said, "and for giving Grace such a good flying voice to share." Daniel crouched down to Sophie's eye level. "Thank you for being such a good flying student, and for being a wonderful friend to Grace." Sophie smiled, not the full, radiant smile she'd had before the accident, but something quieter and newer. Something that acknowledged that happiness could coexist with sadness, that healing didn't mean forgetting. As they drove home, Sophie was more talkative than she'd been in months. She told Julia about the different types of clouds Grace had taught her to identify, about the proper technique for finding the perfect magic stone, about the way the fort felt like a safe place to share important thoughts. "Mama," Sophie said, as they pulled into their driveway, "I think I want to try talking to Dr. Hendricks again. But can I bring my magic stone?" Julia's heart soared. Dr. Hendricks had been asking for months when Sophie might be ready to resume therapy sessions, and Julia had been at a loss for how to encourage it without applying pressure. "I think Dr. Hendricks would love to meet your magic stone," Julia said. "Should we call her tomorrow?" "Yes," Sophie said decisively. "I think I have some important thoughts to share with her too." That evening, as Julia tucked Sophie into bed, her daughter spoke more than she had since the accident. She talked about her day, about Grace's friendship, about feeling ready to remember good things about her father, without them hurting quite so much. "Mama," Sophie said, as Julia was turning off the bedside lamp, "do you think tomorrow will be different from today?" Julia paused her hand on the light switch. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Grace says that when you're growing, each day is a little different from the one before. Not big different, but small different. Like how flowers grow so slowly you don't notice until suddenly they're blooming." Julia sat back down on the edge of Sophie's bed. "I think Grace might be very wise about growing. Do you think today was different from yesterday?" Sophie considered this, her magic stone clutched in her small fist. "Yes," she said finally. "Yesterday, I couldn't remember what Daddy's laugh sounded like. But today, when I was spinning on the swing, I remembered it. Just for a second, but I remembered." Julia felt her eyes fill with tears, not the desperate, helpless tears of the past 18 months, but something that felt like gratitude mixed with hope. "That sounds like exactly the right kind of different," she whispered, kissing Sophie's forehead. As Julia left Sophie's room and headed downstairs to her home office where stacks of work awaited her attention, she found herself thinking about Daniel's words earlier. Sometimes facing the thing we're afraid of takes away its power over us. She'd been so afraid of Sophie's grief, so desperate to shield her from anything that might deepen her pain, that she'd perhaps been shielding her from healing as well. Tomorrow she decided she would call Dr. Hendricks and schedule that appointment. She would also call her sister, who'd been begging to visit, but whom Julia had been putting off because she worried the emotional intensity might overwhelm Sophie. Maybe it was time to stop managing Sophie's world so carefully and start trusting her daughter's own instincts about what she was ready for. The house felt different that night, not quite alive in the way it had been when Michael was there, but no longer the hollow shell it had become after his death. Sophie's voice, tentative and healing, had brought something back into their home. Not the past, but the possibility of a future that could hold both memory and new joy. Julia fell asleep that night to the sound of autumn wind in the trees outside her window, and for the first time in 18 months, it sounded like music rather than mourning. The following morning brought unexpected rain, the kind of gentle autumn drizzle that made everything look soft and contemplative. Julia stood at the kitchen window, watching droplets trace lazy paths down the glass, while her coffee grew cold in her hands. She'd been awake since 5, her mind spinning with the possibility that today might bring another breakthrough, or the fear that yesterday's progress might disappear as suddenly as it had arrived. "Mama, is it still raining?" Sophie's voice drifted from the stairway, and Julia turned to see her daughter padding into the kitchen in her favorite pajamas, the ones with tiny stars scattered across blue fabric. She was clutching her magic stone in one hand and Mr. Whiskers in the other. "Just a little," Julia said, setting down her coffee mug. "But I think it's the kind of rain that might stop by the time we need to leave for the park." Sophie climbed onto the kitchen stool and peered out the window, her expression thoughtful. "Grace told me yesterday that rain makes magic stones more powerful. Something about the water washing away old sadness so new happiness can stick better. Julia smiled, marveling at the wisdom children could find in the simplest things. That sounds very logical to me. Should we test your stone's power level after the rain? Yes, Sophie said solemnly. But first, can you help me call Dr. Hendricks? I've been thinking about what I want to tell her. The request caught Julia off guard, even though Sophie had mentioned wanting to resume therapy the night before. Hearing her daughter take such initiative about her own healing felt surreal after months of coaxing and careful negotiations around every aspect of recovery. Of course, sweetheart. Do you want to call her now or after breakfast? Now, Sophie said decisively. I want to tell her about Grace and the flying swings and my magic stone. And I want to ask her if she thinks Daddy would be proud of me for talking again. Julia's throat tightened. The question that had emerged yesterday in the fort was clearly still weighing on Sophie's mind. She pulled out her phone and dialed Dr. Hendricks's office number, which she knew by heart after 18 months of appointments. Dr. Hendricks's office, this is Margaret speaking. Hi, Margaret. It's Julia Morgan. I was wondering if Dr. Hendricks might have any availability this week. Sophie is ready to resume her sessions. There was a pause, and Julia could hear the surprise in Margaret's voice when she responded. Oh my goodness, that's wonderful news. Let me check her schedule. Would this afternoon work? She had a cancellation at 2 o'clock. Julia looked at Sophie, who was nodding eagerly. That would be perfect. Thank you. As Julia hung up the phone, Sophie slid off her stool and walked over to give her mother a hug, the first unprompted physical affection she'd initiated in months. Thank you for believing I'm ready, Sophie whispered into Julia's shoulder. You know yourself better than anyone else, Julia replied, holding her daughter close and breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. I'm proud of you for trusting your own feelings. By 10 o'clock, the rain had indeed stopped, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling. Sophie had eaten breakfast, actually eaten, not just pushed food around her plate, and had spent 20 minutes carefully selecting which clothes would be best for park activities and therapy appointments. When they arrived at Willowbrook Park, Daniel and Grace were already there, sitting on their familiar picnic blanket. But today there was something different about the scene. Daniel had brought what appeared to be a small, portable keyboard, and Grace was bent over it with intense concentration. Sophie, Grace called out when she spotted them approaching. Look what Daddy brought. It's a practice piano, and I've been learning a song that sounds like flying. Sophie hurried over, her magic stone secure in her pocket. A piano, can it really make flying sounds? Oh yes, Grace said seriously. But it's not just the piano that makes the flying sounds. It's the person playing it. The piano just helps the flying sounds come out of your fingers instead of your voice. Daniel smiled at Julia over the girls' heads. I thought we might try something different today. Music therapy in the great outdoors. Is that what you do at your practice? Sophie asked, settling onto the blanket beside Grace. Help people make flying sounds with pianos. Among other things, Daniel said. I help people find their voices in lots of different ways. Sometimes through singing, sometimes through instruments, sometimes just through listening to music that matches how they're feeling inside. Sophie considered this with the seriousness she brought to all new concepts. What if someone's feelings are too big for regular words? That's when music becomes especially helpful, Daniel explained. Music can hold feelings that are too big or too complicated for words alone. Grace had been quietly pressing keys during this conversation, and suddenly she began to play a simple melody that did indeed sound like something floating through air. The notes were light and ascending, with little trills that sparkled like sunlight on water. That's beautiful, Grace, Julia said, settling onto the blanket. Did you make that up? Daddy helped me, Grace said proudly. We call it cloud dancing. Want to hear the part that sounds like spinning through a kaleidoscope? As Grace played a more complex section with swirling arpeggios. Sophie's eyes widened with recognition. It does sound like kaleidoscope flying. How did you know what that would sound like? I listened to you yesterday when you were spinning on the swing, Grace said matter-of-factly. You made this little humming sound while you were flying, and I remembered it, and asked Daddy to help me find the right notes. Sophie looked amazed. I was humming, I didn't know I was humming. Sometimes our voices know things before our minds do, Daniel said gently. Music has a way of sneaking out even when we think we're being quiet. Grace slid off the bench and patted the space beside her. Want to try playing? I can teach you the cloud dancing part. Sophie glanced at Julia, who nodded encouragingly. As her daughter moved to sit beside Grace at the small keyboard, Julia felt that familiar flutter of hope mixed with anxiety. Sophie had loved music before the accident. She'd been taking piano lessons and had shown real talent for picking out melodies by ear. Put your fingers here, Grace instructed, positioning Sophie's hands on the keys. Now press this one, and let them float into this one. Sophie pressed the keys tentatively, and a simple but lovely melody emerged. Not the complex piece Grace had been playing, but something purely Sophie, gentle and questioning with pauses that felt like breathing. That's perfect, Grace exclaimed. That sounds like morning clouds, the soft ones that look like cotton balls. It does, Sophie agreed, pressing the keys again with slightly more confidence. What would afternoon clouds sound like? Bigger, Grace decided. And maybe a little more golden. She demonstrated with deeper notes that seemed to glow with warmth. As the girls experimented with different cloud sounds, Julia found herself in conversation with Daniel about the upcoming therapy appointment. Sophie wanted to call Dr. Hendricks this morning, Julia explained quietly. She says she has important thoughts to share. I'm amazed by how much initiative she's taking in her own healing process. That's a very good sign, Daniel said. When children start advocating for their own needs, it usually means they're beginning to trust their own inner wisdom again. Have you seen this before? Children recovering from selective mutism after trauma? Daniel nodded. Every child's journey is different, but yes. Sometimes the voice comes back gradually, and sometimes it returns in bursts. The key is usually feeling safe enough to be vulnerable again. They watched as Sophie began to play a melody that Julia recognized, a simplified version of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, but played with such tenderness that it sounded like a lullaby for the sky itself. Daddy used to sing that to me, Sophie said, suddenly, her fingers still moving across the keys. When I was scared of thunderstorms, he said the stars were watching over me even when I couldn't see them through the clouds. Grace nodded solemnly. My mommy used to say something like that. She said the moon was always there, even in the daytime when you couldn't see it. Do you think they're both watching us now? Sophie asked, looking up at the sky where puffy white clouds drifted lazily across the blue. I know they are, Grace said with absolute certainty. And I bet they love hearing us make music together. Sophie smiled, not the tentative, fragile smile of the past few days, but something broader and more genuine. She began to play again, this time humming along with the melody. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying the tune with growing confidence. Julia felt tears spring to her eyes. Michael had indeed sung to Sophie during thunderstorms, and hearing that memory transformed into music felt like watching a miracle unfold in real time. Can I try something? Daniel asked, gently moving to sit on Sophie's other side at the keyboard. There's a technique called musical conversation where two people take turns playing like they're talking to each other with notes instead of words. Sophie nodded and Daniel played a simple four-note phrase that sounded like a question. Sophie listened carefully, then responded with her own four notes that seemed to answer him. Back and forth they went, their musical conversation growing more complex and expressive with each exchange. "It's like they're telling each other secrets," Grace whispered to Julia, her voice full of wonder. And perhaps they were. Sophie's musical responses seemed to carry emotions she wasn't yet ready to put into words: longing, sadness, hope, and something that might have been forgiveness. Daniel's replies were gentle and supportive, acknowledging each emotional offering without trying to fix or change it. After several minutes of this musical dialogue, Sophie played a final phrase that sounded like a sigh of relief. Then she turned to Daniel with shining eyes. "That felt like what my heart sounds like when it's trying to remember how to be happy," she said. Daniel's expression was soft with understanding. "That's exactly what music therapy is supposed to do, help your heart find its voice." Is that what we'll do at your practice, have musical conversations? If you'd like to. We could also explore other ways music might help you process your feelings. Sometimes singing helps, sometimes listening, sometimes just making sound for the joy of it. Sophie was quiet for a moment, considering this. "I think I'd like to try that. After I talked to Dr. Hendricks today." "The two work really well together," Daniel assured her. "Dr. Hendricks helps you understand your thoughts and feelings, and music therapy helps you express them." As the morning progressed, they moved from the keyboard to the playground, where the girls invented new flying games, incorporating musical elements. Grace would hum different melodies while swinging, and Sophie would try to match the rhythm with her movements. When they played in the fort, they discovered that their voices echoed differently among the trees, creating natural harmonies that delighted them both. "Listen to this," Grace said, humming a low note that resonated against the oak tree's trunk. "Now you try a higher note at the same time." Sophie added her voice to Grace's, and the two notes blended together in a way that made the very air around them seem to shimmer with music. "We sound like a choir," Sophie said with wonder. "Like the angels Daddy said sing in heaven." "Maybe we are a choir," Grace replied thoughtfully. "Maybe every time friends make music together, they're making the same kind of sounds that happen in heaven." Julia and Daniel exchanged glances over the girls' heads. There was something almost ethereal about watching these two children, both touched by loss, finding healing through friendship and music. It felt like witnessing something sacred. When lunchtime arrived, they packed up the keyboard and headed to a small cafe near the park that Daniel recommended. Sophie was chatty during the meal, telling Grace about Mr. Whisker's latest antics and asking Daniel more questions about music therapy. "Do you think animals like music too?" Sophie asked, twirling spaghetti around her fork with more appetite than Julia had seen in months. "I think they do," Daniel replied. "Dogs and cats respond to different types of music in interesting ways. Some get calm with classical music, others get energized by jazz." "Mr. Whiskers likes it when I hum," Sophie said. "He purrs louder like he's trying to harmonize with me." "See, he's part of your choir too," Grace said sagely. After lunch, as they walked back to their cars, Sophie suddenly stopped and turned to Daniel with a serious expression. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. Daniel crouched down to her eye level. "Of course." "When Grace's mommy died, did you think Grace might never talk again, like what happened to me?" It was such a direct, vulnerable question that Julia held her breath, waiting for Daniel's response. "I was worried about a lot of things," Daniel said honestly. "But Grace talked more after her mom died, not less. She talked so much it was like she was trying to fill up all the quiet spaces her mom left behind." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. Everyone grieves differently, right? That's what Dr. Hendricks used to say before I stopped talking to her. That's exactly right. There's no wrong way to grieve and there's no timeline for healing. I think I'm ready to grieve the right way for me now, Sophie said. I was scared before that if I talked about missing Daddy, it would make the missing hurt worse. But talking to Grace about missing parents doesn't make it hurt worse. It makes it feel shareable. Julia felt her heart swell with pride. Her 7-year-old daughter had just articulated something it had taken Julia months of her own therapy to understand. Shared sadness is lighter sadness, Grace agreed, slipping her hand into Sophie's. That's what Daddy taught me. As they reached their cars, Sophie turned to Grace with sudden urgency. Will you still be my friend when I'm not sad anymore? I mean, when I'm less sad. Grace looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Sophie, you're my friend because you're you, not because you're sad. I'd be your friend if you were happy all the time, or sad all the time, or medium feelings all the time. Really, really, really. Friends don't stop being friends because feelings change. Feelings are just feelings. Friends are forever. Sophie hugged Grace tightly, and over her shoulder she said to Daniel, "Thank you for teaching Grace how to be such a good friend." Grace taught herself that, Daniel replied. I just tried not to get in her way. An hour later, Julia and Sophie were sitting in Dr. Hendricks's familiar office with its soft lighting and carefully chosen toys that were supposed to help children feel comfortable. Sophie was perched on the edge of the couch, her magic stone visible in her clenched fist. Dr. Hendricks, a kind woman in her 50s, with prematurely gray hair and gentle eyes, looked genuinely amazed to see Sophie sitting there voluntarily. Sophie, she said warmly, I'm so glad you wanted to come see me today. Your mom told me you've been making some new friends. Sophie nodded. Grace and her daddy Daniel. Daniel does music therapy and Grace is teaching me about different kinds of flying. That sounds wonderful. Can you tell me more about this flying? And then, to Julia's amazement, Sophie began to talk. Really talk. Not in the halting, careful way she'd been speaking for the past few days, but with something approaching her old enthusiasm. She told Dr. Hendricks about the swings and the magical thinking behind cloud flying. She described Grace's theories about dragons and magic stones and the way voices could travel on the wind. More importantly, she talked about her father. I was scared that if I talked about missing Daddy, people would try to make me stop missing him, Sophie explained, rolling her magic stone between her palms. But Grace misses her mommy, and she talks about it, and Daniel doesn't try to make her stop. He just listens and says it's okay to miss people forever. Dr. Hendricks nodded encouragingly. It is okay to miss people forever. What else have you discovered about missing your daddy? That I can miss him and be happy about other things at the same time, Sophie said thoughtfully. Yesterday I was sad about not remembering his voice clearly, but I was also happy about learning to play piano melodies with Grace. Both feelings were true at the same time. That's a very mature observation, Sophie. How does it feel to hold both of those feelings together? Sophie considered this seriously. Like being a bigger person inside. Like there's more room in me for complicated things. Julia felt tears threatening again. When had her 7-year-old daughter become so wise? The session continued for another 30 minutes, with Sophie sharing more about her fears, her memories, and her growing sense that it might be possible to heal without forgetting. She asked Dr. Hendricks the question that had been weighing on her. Would her father be proud of her for talking again? What do you think? Dr. Hendricks asked gently. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. I think Daddy would be proud of me for being brave enough to be sad when I needed to be sad, and brave enough to try being happy again when I was ready. I think he'd like Grace and he'd probably want to learn about cloud flying too. I think you're absolutely right, Dr. Hendricks said. And Sophie, I think he'd be especially proud of you for trusting yourself to know when you were ready to heal. As they prepared to leave Doctor's, Hendricks walked them to the door. I'd like to see you again next week if that's okay with you, Sophie. We have a lot more to talk about. Sophie nodded eagerly. Can I bring my magic stone? And maybe next time I could tell you about the musical conversations. I'd love to hear about both of those things. Driving home, Sophie was unusually quiet, but it was the thoughtful quiet of someone processing new understanding, rather than the hollow silence of the past 18 months. How did that feel? Julia asked as they pulled into their driveway. Good, Sophie said simply. Really good. Like I don't have to carry all my feelings by myself anymore. That evening, as Julia was making dinner, Sophie came into the kitchen carrying her magic stone and something else, a small notebook Julia hadn't seen before. What's that, sweetheart? I'm starting a journal, Sophie announced. Dr. Hendricks suggested it. I want to write down all the good things that happen each day so I don't forget them. Today, I want to write about the musical conversation with Daniel and how Grace's hug felt like sunshine, and how Mr. Whiskers purred extra loud when I practiced humming. Julia paused in her chopping of vegetables, overwhelmed by the normalcy of the moment. Sophie, planning for tomorrow, engaging with the present, actively choosing to document joy. These were the behaviors of a child who believed in her own future again. That sounds like a wonderful idea, Julia said. Would you like to write in it now or after dinner? Now. Sophie decided, settling at the kitchen table with her notebook and a set of colored pencils. I want to make sure I remember everything exactly right. As Sophie wrote and drew, occasionally asking Julia how to spell words like kaleidoscope and harmonize, Julia felt something shift in her own chest. For 18 months, she'd been holding her breath, waiting for her daughter to come back to life. Tonight, she finally felt like she could exhale. Sophie was still changed by loss, she always would be. But she was also healing, growing, becoming someone new and resilient and surprisingly wise. The little girl who'd stopped speaking after trauma was becoming a young person who understood that healing didn't mean forgetting, that friendship could be found in unexpected places, and that sometimes the most profound conversations happened without words at all. When Sophie finished her journal entry, she showed it to Julia proudly. Along with her careful 7-year-old handwriting, she'd drawn pictures of swings that looked like musical notes, clouds shaped like hearts, and 2 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. This is us and Grace and Daniel, Sophie explained, pointing to the stick figures. The rainbow is all the music we made together. It's beautiful, sweetheart. Are you excited to see them again tomorrow? Sophie nodded emphatically. Grace said she wants to teach me a song about brave butterflies, and Daniel said maybe I could try writing my own musical conversation to play for them. As Julia tucked Sophie into bed that night, her daughter was clutching both her magic stone and her new journal. Mama, Sophie said, as Julia was turning off the light, I think tomorrow is going to be even more different from today than today was from yesterday. What makes you think that? Sophie smiled in the darkness. Because every day I remember a little more about who I am, and every day discover a little more about who I'm becoming. Grace says that's what growing up really means. Julia kissed her daughter's forehead, marveling at the wisdom that seemed to flow so naturally from this remarkable little girl who'd found her voice again through friendship music and the simple magic of being understood. Sweet dreams, my brave butterfly. Julia whispered, using Sophie's old nickname for the first time since the accident. Sweet dreams, Mama. Tomorrow we're going to make even more beautiful music. And as Julia closed Sophie's bedroom door and headed downstairs, she found herself actually humming, for the first time in 18 months. The melody was simple and hopeful, floating through their house like a promise of all the good tomorrows still to come. 3 weeks later, the November air carried the crisp promise of winter, as Julia sat in her car outside Daniel's music therapy practice on Maple Street, watching Sophie skip up the front steps with an enthusiasm that still caught Julia off guard. Her daughter was clutching her journal, now filled with dozens of entries about daily discoveries and the magic stone that had become her constant companion. The building was a converted Victorian house painted soft yellow with white trim, its front porch lined with wind chimes that created gentle melodies in the autumn breeze. A sign by the door read, "Harmony Healing Center," in flowing script, and through the large front windows, Julia could see children's artwork covering the walls inside. "Are you coming in today, Mama?" Sophie asked, turning back toward the car. Over the past weeks, she'd grown comfortable enough with Daniel's practice to sometimes go in alone, but today felt different somehow, more significant. "If you'd like me to," Julia replied, stepping out of the car. Daniel said he had something special planned for today's session. Inside, the converted house felt warm and welcoming, with hardwood floors that creaked musically underfoot, and rooms that had been transformed into different therapeutic spaces. Grace came running from a back room, her red curls bouncing as she threw her arms around Sophie in their now customary greeting hug. "Sophie, perfect timing. Daddy's been setting up the recording equipment, and I've been practicing our song all week." Grace's excitement was infectious, and Julia saw Sophie's eyes light up with anticipation. "Recording equipment?" Sophie asked, looking both thrilled and slightly nervous. Daniel emerged from what appeared to be a converted dining room, carrying microphone stands and cables. "I thought today might be a good day to capture some of the music you and Grace have been creating together. Nothing formal or scary, just a way to preserve the beautiful sounds you've been making." Julia felt a flutter of anxiety. Sophie had been making remarkable progress, but was she ready for something that felt so official, so permanent? But Sophie surprised her. "Like making a real song that people could listen to." "Exactly like that," Daniel confirmed. "Daniel, I was thinking we could record the butterfly song Grace taught you, and maybe that musical conversation piece you've been working on. Would you like that?" Sophie nodded eagerly, then paused with a sudden thought. "Could we record something for Daddy, like a message he could hear if he was listening from heaven?" The question hung in the air, so innocent and yet so profound that Julia felt her breath catch. Grace immediately understood the significance and grabbed Sophie's hands. "Oh yes, like when I sing to Mommy in the garden. Daddy would love that." Grace's enthusiasm made the idea feel natural rather than heartbreaking. Daniel's expression was gentle and encouraging. "That sounds like a beautiful idea, Sophie. What would you want to say to him?" Sophie thought for a moment, rolling her magic stone between her palms, a gesture that had become her way of accessing her deepest thoughts. "I want to tell him about how I found my voice again, and about Grace, and about how missing him doesn't feel so scary anymore, because I know he's proud of me for being brave." Julia felt tears threaten, but they were different tears than she'd cried over the past 18 months. These were tears of recognition, seeing her daughter not just healing, but thriving in ways that honored both her grief and her growth. "Let's start with something easier and work our way up to that," Daniel suggested practically. "Why don't you and Grace show me the butterfly song first?" The recording room was cozy with acoustic panels on the walls and a beautiful grand piano taking up most of the space. Grace immediately went to the piano bench while Sophie settled into a comfortable chair nearby her journal, open on her lap. The butterfly song is about being brave enough to change, Grace explained to Julia and Daniel as her fingers found the opening chords. Butterflies have to trust that being different is okay, just like people do when they're growing up, after sad things happen. Grace began to play, and Sophie joined in with her voice, not the strong, confident singing she'd done before the accident, but something softer and more nuanced, filled with hard-won wisdom. The lyrics they'd written together told the story of a caterpillar afraid to build its cocoon because it didn't want to stop being what it had always been. But sometimes, Sophie sang, her voice growing stronger with each verse. Growing means letting go of who you were to become who you're meant to be. And that's not losing yourself, that's finding yourself. Julia listened with amazement. When had her 7-year-old daughter developed such sophisticated understanding of transformation and identity? The song was simple enough for a child to understand, but contained truths that many adults struggled to accept. When they finished, Daniel was quiet for a moment. That was extraordinary. The way you two blend your voices together, it's like you're telling the story from both inside and outside the transformation. That's because Grace understands about changing, Sophie explained. When her mommy died, she had to learn how to be a different kind of daughter, one who remembers instead of one who gets hugs every day. And I had to learn how to be a different kind of daughter too. Grace nodded solemnly. We're both butterfly daughters now. As they worked through recording several songs, Julia found herself in conversation with Daniel in the hallway outside the recording room. Through the open door, they could watch the girls collaborating with the easy intimacy of siblings, finishing each other's musical phrases and laughing when they made mistakes. Has Sophie talked to you about starting school again? Daniel asked quietly. Grace has been asking when Sophie might join her class. Julia sighed. We've discussed it. She's been homeschooling with a tutor since the accident, but lately she's been expressing interest in being around other children again. I'm terrified, honestly. What terrifies you about it? What if the other kids don't understand? What if they ask too many questions about where she's been, or why she's different now? What if she's not ready and she regresses? Daniel was quiet for a moment, listening to the girls' laughter drifting from the recording room. You know, Grace went through something similar when she was ready to go back to school after her mom died. I was convinced the other children would say the wrong thing, or that she'd break down, or that I was pushing her too fast. What happened? She thrived. Not immediately, and not without some difficult moments, but she needed to be around children who hadn't known her before her loss. They didn't treat her like a fragile thing to be protected. They just saw her as Grace. Sometimes that perspective from people who don't know our before story can be incredibly healing. From the recording room came the sound of Sophie attempting a complex piano piece, her fingers stumbling over the notes, but her voice carrying the melody with growing confidence. Listen to her, Daniel said gently. Does that sound like a child who's fragile? Julia had to admit it didn't. Sophie sounded like a child who was actively engaged with the world, someone who was building rather than just surviving. Sophie's teacher at Willowbrook Elementary is wonderful with children who've experienced trauma, Daniel continued. Grace is in her class, and Mrs. Patterson has a way of creating safe spaces for all kinds of healing. You really think she's ready? Before Daniel could answer, Sophie's voice called out from the recording room. Mama Daniel, come listen to this. I figured out how to play the cloud-flying melody on the piano, and Grace added harmony, and it sounds like Daddy's flying dreams. Julia and Daniel returned to find Sophie at the piano, her small hands moving across the keys with newfound confidence. The melody she was playing was indeed reminiscent of flight ascending phrases that seemed to lift off the keyboard and spiral through the air. Grace was humming a harmony that wove around Sophie's melody like wind currents supporting wings. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Julia said, settling into a chair to listen properly. "I want to record this one for Daddy," Sophie announced. "But I want to add words. Is that okay?" "Of course," Daniel said, adjusting the microphone position. "What words do you want to add?" Sophie closed her eyes for a moment, her magic stone clutched in her free hand. When she opened them, her expression was serene and determined. "I want to tell him that I remember now. Not just the scary parts, but the flying parts, too. I want him to know that Grace taught me about butterfly daughters, and that I'm growing into someone who can miss him and be happy at the same time." As Sophie began to play and sing, her words flowing over the melody, like water over stones, Julia felt something profound shift in her understanding of her daughter's journey. This wasn't just recovery. This was transformation. Sophie wasn't trying to get back to who she'd been before the accident. She was becoming someone entirely new, someone who carried both loss and hope with equal grace. "Daddy, I found my voice again." Sophie sang her words clear and strong. "It sounds different now, quieter in some ways, stronger in others. But it's mine, and I'm not afraid of it anymore. Grace says you can hear me when I sing to the sky, so I'm singing to you every day now." The song continued with Sophie sharing stories about her friendship with Grace, her sessions with Dr. Hendricks, her growing comfort with big feelings, and her excitement about maybe starting school again. Grace added musical flourishes and occasional harmony, creating a sound that was both ethereal and grounded. When the song ended, the room was filled with a profound silence that felt sacred rather than empty. "That was perfect," Daniel said softly. "Sophie, that was one of the most beautiful songs I've ever had the privilege to record." Sophie beamed with pride, then looked at Julia with sudden seriousness. "Mama, I think I'm ready for school. Not because I'm all better, I don't think I'll ever be all better from missing Daddy, but because I'm ready to be myself in new places with new people." Julia felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Are you sure we don't have to rush anything?" "I'm sure," Sophie said firmly. "Grace told me about her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, and about the other kids in her class. I want to try being a regular kid again, but a regular kid who's also a butterfly daughter." That afternoon, after they'd finished recording and said goodbye to Daniel and Grace, Julia called Willowbrook Elementary to schedule a meeting with Mrs. Patterson. As she spoke to the school secretary explaining Sophie's situation and asking about the process for enrollment, Sophie sat nearby, adding new entries to her journal. "What are you writing about today?" Julia asked when she hung up the phone. "About the recording session, and about feeling ready for new adventures," Sophie replied, not looking up from her careful lettering. "And about how sometimes being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing important things, even when you are scared." 3 days later, they sat in Mrs. Patterson's classroom, after school hours, getting acquainted with what might become Sophie's new learning environment. The classroom was bright and welcoming, with reading corners and art stations, and a small piano in one corner that made Sophie's eyes light up with interest. Mrs. Patterson was a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and an easy smile, the type of teacher who radiated competence and warmth in equal measure. She spoke to Sophie directly, rather than talking over her head to Julia, treating her as a person worthy of respect and attention. "Grace has told me so much about you," Mrs. Patterson said, settling into a child-sized chair next to Sophie. "She's very excited about the possibility of having you in our class. Would you like to tell me a little about yourself?" Sophie glanced at Julia, who nodded encouragingly, then took a deep breath. "I'm 7 years old, and I like music and magic stones and writing in my journal. I've been learning at home for a while because talking was hard for me after my daddy died. but I'm learning how to talk about important things again, and I think I'm ready to learn with other kids." The honesty and directness of Sophie's response impressed Mrs. Patterson, who nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like very hard work you've been doing, learning how to talk about important things. I'm proud of you for recognizing when you're ready for new challenges." "Grace says you're good at helping kids with big feelings," Sophie said. "Do you really understand about missing parents?" Mrs. Patterson's expression grew gentle. "I do understand. My own father died when I was not much older than you, and I remember how confusing it was to feel sad and happy and angry and grateful all at the same time. Learning to hold all those feelings together is some of the most important work we do as humans." Sophie seemed to consider this seriously. "Grace and I call ourselves butterfly daughters because we had to change after our parents died. Do you think other kids will understand about that?" "I think children understand more than we give them credit for," Mrs. Patterson replied. "And the children in our class are particularly good at accepting differences and supporting each other. Would you like to meet some of them?" Mrs. Patterson introduced Sophie to several students who were staying after school for various activities. There was Marcus, whose parents had divorced the previous year, and who understood about family changes. There was Emma, who was being raised by her grandmother and knew about missing parents. There was David, who struggled with anxiety and understood about needing quiet spaces sometimes. Sophie listened to each child's story with the kind of attention she'd learned to give during her conversations with Grace and Dr. Hendricks. When it was her turn to share, she spoke simply and honestly about her father's death and her period of silence, and about how music and friendship had helped her find her voice again. "That's really cool that you can make up songs," Emma said admiringly. "I wish I could do that." "Grace is teaching me," Sophie replied. "Maybe she could teach you too if you wanted." As they walked around the classroom, exploring learning centers and looking at student artwork, Sophie seemed to grow more comfortable with each passing minute. She asked thoughtful questions about daily routines, lunch procedures, and whether there were quiet spaces available when feelings got too big. "We have a peace corner," Mrs. Patterson explained, showing Sophie a cozy nook with soft cushions and a small bookshelf. "Any student can ask to spend time there when they need to collect themselves. We also have a buddy system where each student has a partner they can turn to for support." "Could Grace be my buddy?" Sophie asked hopefully. "I think that could be arranged." Mrs. Patterson smiled. On the drive home, Sophie was unusually quiet, processing the afternoon's experiences. Finally, as they pulled into their driveway, she spoke. "Mama, I think I want to try it. Not every day at first, maybe just 3 days a week to start. But I think I'm ready to be around kids who don't know about my before time." Julia felt a mixture of pride and terror. Her protective instincts wanted to keep Sophie safe at home where she could monitor every interaction and shield her from potential hurt. But her rational mind recognized that Sophie was demonstrating remarkable self-awareness about her own readiness. "If that's what you want, then we'll make it happen," Julia said. "But you have to promise to tell me if it becomes too much, okay? There's no shame in needing more time." "I promise," Sophie said solemnly. "But Mama, I think I'm stronger than we thought I was. Not the same kind of strong I was before Daddy died, but a different kind. A butterfly daughter kind of strong." That evening, Sophie called Grace to share the news about starting school. Julia listened from the kitchen as her daughter's excited chatter filled the house, discussing which days she'd attend, what supplies she'd need, and what songs they might perform for their classmates. "Grace wants to write a welcome song for my first day," Sophie announced when she hung up the phone. "She says new beginnings deserve their own music." Later, as Julia was tucking Sophie into bed, her daughter pulled out her journal for her nightly writing ritual. The entries had grown longer and more complex over the weeks, documenting not just daily events, but Sophie's evolving understanding of herself and her place in the world. "What are you writing about tonight?" Julia asked, settling on the edge of the bed. "About being excited and scared at the same time, and how that's okay," Sophie said, her pencil moving carefully across the page. "And about how Daddy would probably want me to try new things, even if they feel big and scary." She paused in her writing and looked up at Julia with serious eyes. "Mama, do you think Daddy would be proud of how we're both growing? Not just me, but you too." The question caught Julia off guard. She'd been so focused on Sophie's healing journey that she hadn't fully considered her own transformation over the past few weeks. But Sophie was right. Julia had been growing too, learning to trust her daughter's instincts, finding the courage to step back and let Sophie lead her own recovery. "I think he'd be amazed by both of us," Julia said honestly. "I think he'd be proud of how brave you've been and how you've learned to help yourself heal. And maybe he'd be proud of me for learning to trust you, to know what you need." Sophie smiled and returned to her journal entry. As she wrote, she spoke her thoughts aloud, a habit she'd developed that Julia found both endearing and insightful. "Today, I decided to be brave about school," Sophie wrote and spoke simultaneously. "Not because I'm not scared, but because being scared doesn't mean I can't do important things. Grace says courage isn't the opposite of fear, it's doing what matters, even when you're afraid." Julia watched her daughter write, marveling at the wisdom that seemed to flow so naturally from her small hands. Sophie was documenting her own healing journey with the thoroughness of a researcher and the heart of a poet. "I'm still a girl who misses her daddy every day," Sophie continued writing. "But I'm also a girl who has a best friend and who makes music and who's ready to meet new people. I can be both things at the same time, and that's okay." When Sophie finished her entry, she closed the journal and settled into bed, clutching her magic stone as she had every night for weeks. "Mama," she said, as Julia was turning off the bedside lamp, "tomorrow is going to be different from today again, isn't it?" "Yes, sweetheart. How does that feel?" Sophie was quiet for a moment, considering. "Good," she said finally. "Really good. Because I'm not afraid of different anymore. Different means growing, and growing means becoming who I'm supposed to be." As Julia kissed her daughter goodnight and headed downstairs, she reflected on the remarkable journey they'd traveled together over the past month. From that first day at Willowbrook Park, when Sophie had made her first tentative sounds, to tonight's confident declaration about embracing change, the transformation had been nothing short of miraculous. But perhaps the real miracle wasn't that Sophie had found her voice again. Perhaps it was that she'd found a new voice, one that could hold complexity and contradiction, joy and sorrow, fear and courage all at the same time. She'd become someone who understood that healing didn't mean forgetting, that growing sometimes meant letting go of who you used to be to become who you were meant to be. And in watching Sophie's transformation, Julia had undergone her own metamorphosis. She'd learned to trust her daughter's inner wisdom, to support rather than direct Sophie's healing journey, and to find hope in the midst of ongoing grief. Tomorrow would indeed be different from today. In a week, Sophie would start her first day at Willowbrook Elementary, nervous but determined, carrying her magic stone and her journal, and all the hard-won wisdom of a butterfly daughter, ready to spread her wings in new spaces. Julia fell asleep that night to the sound of November wind in the trees outside her window, and for the first time since Michael's death, it sounded like a lullaby of possibility, rather than a lament for what was lost. 6 months later, the spring air hummed with the kind of energy that made everything feel possible as Julia sat in the auditorium of Willowbrook Elementary, watching children file onto the small stage for the annual spring recital. Her heart raced with anticipation and pride as she spotted Sophie among the performers, her daughter's dark hair gleaming under the stage lights, her magic stone now polished smooth from months of handling, tucked safely in her pocket. Sophie had not only successfully transitioned to school, but had become one of Mrs. Patterson's most engaged students, forming friendships that extended far beyond her bond with Grace. She'd discovered a love for creative writing that complemented her musical talents, and had even started a lunchtime club called Butterfly Stories, where children shared tales of transformation and resilience. "There she is," Daniel whispered from the seat beside Julia Grace, bouncing excitedly on his other side. Over the months, their two families had grown closer, sharing dinners and holiday celebrations, creating a chosen family structure that felt both natural and necessary. "She looks so confident up there." Julia nodded, unable to speak around the emotion lodging in her throat. Sophie did look confident, not with the unconscious ease she'd possessed before the accident, but with something deeper and more intentional. She carried herself like someone who had journeyed through darkness and emerged with hard-won wisdom. The program began with younger classes performing simple songs, but Julia found her attention drifting to memories of how far they'd all come. Sophie's journal now filled 3 notebooks documenting not just her healing journey, but her growing understanding of herself as someone who could help others navigate difficult emotions. Dr. Hendricks had been amazed by Sophie's progress, noting that her client had developed emotional intelligence far beyond her years. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Patterson's voice drew Julia back to the present as she took the microphone. "Our next performance is very special. 2 of our students have written and composed an original song about friendship healing and the courage to grow. Please welcome Sophie Morgan and Grace Carter." Julia's breath caught as Sophie and Grace walked to the center of the stage, Grace carrying her small keyboard, while Sophie held a folder of sheet music. They'd been secretive about this performance for weeks, working on it during their after-school sessions with Daniel, and practicing in hushed whispers during playdates. "Before we sing our song," Sophie said into the microphone, her voice clear and strong, "we want to tell you why we wrote it." Grace moved closer to share the microphone. "We wrote it for anyone who's ever felt broken and didn't know if they could be whole again. For anyone who's lost someone important and wondered if they'd ever be happy again. And for anyone who's discovered that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from hearts that have learned how to heal." Sophie added her words, carrying the weight of lived experience. Julia felt tears already beginning to blur her vision. Around the auditorium, she could see other parents leaning forward, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Grace settled at her keyboard and began to play an introduction that was both haunting and hopeful, a melody that seemed to acknowledge sadness while pointing toward light. When Sophie began to sing, her voice had a quality Julia had never heard before. Not the pure innocence of her pre-accident singing, but something richer and more textured, aged by experience and deepened by understanding. "There was a little girl who lost her voice one day." Sophie sang the lyrics, flowing over Grace's gentle accompaniment. "The world became too loud, too scary, too much to say. She built walls of silence thinking they would keep her safe, but silence became a prison that she couldn't escape." The song told the story of their friendship, but in metaphorical terms that made it universal. It spoke of a songbird who'd forgotten how to sing, meeting a little musician who helped her remember that melodies could carry pain as well as joy. It described the slow process of trust, the courage required to be vulnerable, and the magic that happened when 2 wounded souls decided to heal together. "But then she met a friend who didn't need her to be strong." Grace joined in harmony, her voice blending perfectly with Sophie's. "Who sat beside her in the silence and said, 'It's okay to take your time with healing. It's okay to grow at your own pace. The world will wait for you to find your voice again.'" As the song progressed, Julia realized that this wasn't just Sophie's story. It was Grace's too, and Daniel's, and her own. It was the story of anyone who'd ever had to rebuild themselves after loss. Anyone who'd discovered that healing wasn't about returning to who you were before, but about becoming someone new and resilient and unexpectedly wise. The final verse made Julia's heart soar with recognition and pride. Now we know that voices come in many different forms. Sometimes they're whispers, sometimes songs, sometimes they're the silence that holds space for others' storms. We learned that healing isn't lonely when you find someone who understands that broken hearts can still make beautiful music when they beat together. As the song ended, the auditorium erupted in applause that felt different from typical recital appreciation. This was the sound of a community recognizing something profound, parents and teachers and children responding to the authentic vulnerability these two young performers had shared. Sophie and Grace took their bows, beaming at each other with the satisfaction of artists who knew they'd communicated something important. As they left the stage, Julia saw Sophie scan the audience until her eyes found Julia's, and the smile that passed between them contained months of shared growth and mutual pride. After the recital, the lobby buzzed with conversations about the girls' performance. Julia found herself surrounded by other parents, teachers, and community members who wanted to share how deeply the song had affected them. "Your daughter is remarkable," said a woman Julia recognized as the mother of one of Sophie's classmates. "My son has been struggling since his grandmother died last year, and hearing Sophie's story tonight, I think it might help him understand that it's okay to take time to heal." Mrs. Patterson approached with tears in her eyes. "Julia, I have to tell you, Sophie has become one of our most compassionate students. Just yesterday, she spent her recess sitting with a new student who was feeling overwhelmed teaching her breathing exercises she learned from Dr. Hendricks. She has this gift for helping other children feel less alone with their big feelings." Daniel appeared at Julia's side, Grace's hand in his, both of them glowing with pride. "I keep thinking about that first day at the park," he said quietly. "Did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" Julia shook her head, watching Sophie across the lobby as she demonstrated proper magic stone-holding technique to a group of younger children who'd been fascinated by her story. "I couldn't have imagined any of this. 6 months ago, I was just hoping she might speak again. I never dreamed she'd become someone who helps other people find their voices too." "That's what healing does," Grace said, with characteristic wisdom, looking up at the adults with serious eyes. "When you figure out how to feel better, you want to help other people feel better too. It's like being a teacher for hearts." As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, Sophie ran over with excitement radiating from every part of her small frame. "Mama, did you hear Mrs. Patterson wants Grace and me to perform our song at the District Arts Festival next month? And the music teacher from the middle school was here tonight," she said. "When we get to 6th grade, we can join the advanced choir." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Julia said, pulling Sophie into a hug. "I'm so proud of you. Not just for the performance, but for everything you've become." Sophie pulled back to look at her mother seriously. "I couldn't have become this person without you believing I could heal, and without Grace showing me how to be brave, and without Daniel teaching me that music can hold any feeling I need it to hold. And don't forget Dr. Hendricks," Grace added loyally. "She taught Sophie how to organize her thoughts, so they didn't feel so scary." "And you, Grace," Sophie said, turning to her best friend. "You taught me the most important thing of all, that friendship means accepting someone exactly as they are, while also believing they can grow into whoever they're meant to be." As they walked out into the warm spring evening, Julia reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The terror of those first 18 months of silence felt like a distant nightmare now replaced by the daily reality of a daughter who not only spoke but used her voice to lift others up. Sophie had recently started volunteering with Daniel at his practice, helping younger children who were working through their own trauma. Her natural empathy, combined with her hard-won understanding of the healing process, made her remarkably effective at connecting with kids who felt lost in their own silence. "You know what I've been thinking about," Daniel said, as they reached their cars in the parking lot. "That first day when Grace gave Sophie the magic stone. I don't think any of us realized we were starting something that would change all our lives." "The magic stone wasn't really magic," Sophie said thoughtfully, pulling the smooth gray rock from her pocket and turning it over in her palm. "But believing in magic was magic. Believing I could get better was what made getting better possible." Grace nodded sagely. "And believing we could be friends even though we were both sad was what made us not sad all the time anymore." Julia marveled at the wisdom these two children had developed through their shared journey. They'd learned lessons about resilience, friendship, and the nature of healing that many adults never mastered. As they prepared to part ways, a temporary separation since they'd see each other the next day for their usual weekend playdate, Sophie suddenly turned to Julia with a question that had clearly been brewing in her mind. "Mama, I've been thinking about something important, and I want to know what you think." "What is it, sweetheart?" "I want to write a book about butterfly daughters and magic stones and finding your voice after it gets lost. For other kids who might be stuck in silence and need to know they can heal too." Julia felt her heart swell with pride and amazement. "I think that's a beautiful idea, Sophie. What would you call it?" Sophie smiled, her expression thoughtful and determined. "I'd call it The Magic Stone Song, a story about finding your voice again. And I'd dedicate it to Daddy for teaching me that love doesn't disappear when someone dies. It just changes into different kinds of music." "Can I help you write it?" Grace asked eagerly. "I have lots of ideas about the music parts." "Of course, we're better writers when we write together, just like we're better singers when we sing together." As they finally said their goodbyes and headed to their respective cars, Julia felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the unexpected gifts that had emerged from their darkest period. Yes, they'd lost Michael, and that loss would always be part of their story. But they'd also gained Grace and Daniel, a chosen family that felt like destiny. They'd discovered reserves of strength and resilience they never knew they possessed. And Sophie had transformed from a child silenced by trauma into a young person who used her voice to heal others. The drive home was filled with Sophie's chatter about the book she wanted to write, the songs she and Grace were composing for their next performance, and her plans for the upcoming summer vacation. Her voice, once lost for 18 months, now seemed unable to contain all the thoughts and dreams and observations she wanted to share with the world. "Mama," Sophie said, as they pulled into their driveway, "I know this might sound strange, but I'm glad the sad thing happened to us." Julia turned in her seat, surprised by the statement. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "I mean, I'm sad that Daddy died and I'll always miss him," Sophie explained carefully. "But if it hadn't happened, I never would have met Grace, and I never would have learned about music therapy, and I never would have discovered that I could help other kids who feel lost and scared." She paused, organizing her thoughts with the deliberation she'd learned through months of therapy. "I wouldn't choose for Daddy to die," she continued. "But since it did happen, I'm glad we found ways to make something beautiful grow from something terrible. I think that's what Daddy would want, for his death to somehow lead to life being better for other people." Julia felt tears flowing freely down her cheeks, not tears of sadness, but tears of recognition and profound love for this remarkable little girl who taught her so much about courage and growth and the resilience of the human heart. "I think you're absolutely right," Julia whispered. I think Daddy would be amazed by the person you've become and the way you're using your experiences to help others heal." That night, as Julia tucked Sophie into bed, her daughter pulled out her journal for what had become a sacred nightly ritual. But tonight, instead of writing in her usual notebook, she opened a brand new journal, one with a cover featuring butterflies and musical notes that Daniel and Grace had given her after the performance. "This is going to be my book journal," Sophie announced, "for writing the Magic Stone story. The first page is going to be about that day at the park when Grace taught me about cloud flying, and I made my first whoosh sound in 18 months. She began to write, her hand moving confidently across the page. "Once upon a time, there was a little girl who lost her voice when her daddy died. She thought the voice was gone forever, but really it was just hiding, waiting for the right friend to help her find it again." This is the story of how she learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting, and how the most beautiful songs sometimes come from hearts that have learned to sing through sadness. Julia watched her daughter write, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. Sophie was no longer the child she'd been before the accident. That innocent, uncomplicated little girl was gone forever. But in her place had emerged someone more complex and wise, someone who understood that growth often required loss, that strength could coexist with vulnerability, and that the most profound healing happened not in isolation, but in connection with others who understood the landscape of grief. "Mama," Sophie said, looking up from her writing, "will you help me remember all the details about our story? I want to get everything right for the kids who might read it someday." "Of course, sweetheart. We'll remember it together." Sophie smiled and returned to her writing, occasionally pausing to ask Julia about specific details or to test out different ways of describing the emotions of those early days. As she worked, she hummed softly a melody that combined elements of all the songs she and Grace had created together, a musical autobiography of healing and growth. Julia sat in the comfortable chair beside Sophie's bed, watching her daughter document their shared journey of transformation. Outside, the spring evening was alive with the sounds of new beginnings, birds calling to each other in the darkness, wind stirring the leaves of trees, just coming into bloom, the distant laughter of neighborhood children playing in their yards. When Sophie finally finished her first entry and closed the journal, she settled into bed with a contentment that Julia had never expected to see again. "I love you, Mama," Sophie said, clutching both her magic stone and her new journal. "Thank you for believing I could heal even when I didn't believe it myself." "I love you too, my brave butterfly daughter," Julia replied, using the nickname that had become a badge of honor rather than a reminder of loss. "Thank you for teaching me that sometimes the most important thing a parent can do is trust their child to know what they need." As Julia turned off the bedside lamp and headed toward the door, Sophie's voice stopped her one last time. "Mama, tomorrow is going to be different from today again, isn't it?" Julia smiled in the darkness, remembering all the times Sophie had asked that question over the past months, always with a sense of anticipation rather than fear. "Yes, sweetheart. Tomorrow will be different." "What do you think it will bring?" "New music," Sophie said confidently. "And maybe new friends who need to learn about magic stones and butterfly daughters. And definitely more pages in my book." Julia closed Sophie's door and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the sounds of their house settling into evening quiet. But it wasn't the hollow silence that had characterized their home for 18 months after Michael's death. This was a peaceful quiet full of potential and promise, the kind of silence that held space for dreams to grow. Downstairs, Julia poured herself a cup of tea and settled at the kitchen table with her laptop. She'd been thinking about Sophie's book project, and she realized she wanted to document her own journey as well, not for publication, but for Sophie, for the day when her daughter might want to understand her mother's perspective on their shared healing process. She began to type, "The day my daughter stopped speaking, I thought our story was over. I couldn't imagine how we would survive the silence, let alone thrive in it. But what I've learned is that some stories don't end, they transform. They become something deeper and more beautiful than anything you could have planned or anticipated." Sophie's voice came back not as an echo of who she used to be, but as a completely new song, one that could hold complexity and contradiction, joy and sorrow, hope and grief all at the same time. In learning to sing again, she taught me that healing doesn't mean returning to who you were before trauma. It means becoming who you're meant to be because of everything you've experienced, both beautiful and terrible. Tomorrow, Sophie will wake up excited about the book she's writing, the songs she's composing with her best friend, and the new classmates she might be able to help navigate their own difficult emotions. She'll carry her magic stone not because she needs it for courage anymore, but because it reminds her that believing in the possibility of healing is the first step toward making healing real. And I'll wake up grateful not for the loss that started this journey, but for everything we've discovered about resilience, love, friendship, and the incredible capacity of the human heart to transform pain into purpose. Some stories end with, "and they lived happily ever after." But the best stories, I think, end with, "and they lived bravely ever after." Understanding that happiness and sadness, loss and growth, endings and beginnings can all coexist in the beautiful, complicated symphony of a life fully lived. Julia saved the document and closed her laptop, feeling the satisfaction of having captured something important about their journey. Upstairs, she could hear Sophie talking quietly to herself as she drifted off to sleep. Not the worried muttering of someone processing trauma, but the content rambling of a child making plans and dreaming dreams. As Julia prepared for bed herself, she thought about Daniel's words from months ago, "Sometimes facing the thing we're afraid of takes away its power over us." They'd all been afraid of Sophie's silence, of permanent damage, of a future defined by loss rather than growth. But in facing those fears together, in choosing connection over isolation and hope over despair, they'd discovered something extraordinary. They'd learned that the most beautiful music sometimes comes from instruments that have been broken and carefully repaired. That the strongest voices often belong to those who've had to fight to find them again. And that the deepest friendships are forged not in the absence of struggle, but in the willingness to struggle together. Julia fell asleep that night to the sound of spring rain beginning to fall, not the gentle drizzle that had marked Sophie's return to school, but a stronger rain that would nourish the gardens and help the flowers bloom. And in her dreams, she heard music, not just Sophie and Grace's voices blending in harmony, but a whole chorus of children who'd learned to sing again after silence, who discovered that their scars could become sources of strength, and who were using their hard-won wisdom to help others find their own paths toward healing. When morning came, Sophie would wake up ready to write the next chapter of her book, to compose new songs with Grace, and to continue the beautiful ongoing work of growing into the person she was meant to become. And Julia would wake up ready to support that growth, to trust her daughter's instincts, and to continue learning from the remarkable little girl who'd taught her that sometimes losing your voice is how you discover what you truly need to say. Their story wasn't ending. It was just the beginning. A new verse, one filled with music and magic, and the infinite possibility that comes from choosing courage over fear, connection over isolation, and hope over despair. And that, Julia thought as she drifted off to sleep, was the most beautiful ending of all.